These days, it's sort of understood that games should be using their mechanics to tell their story. This is usually called Ludonarrative, a term coined by former LucasArts designer Clint Hocking, meaning play narrative, and it's typically taken to mean that a game's story is an outgrowth of your experience playing it. Think of how BioShock uses the linear and limited nature of games to discuss free will, or Nier Automata tying its RPG mechanics to your Android character's programming and hard drive space, or everything Undertale does. This is often held up as one of the things that sets games apart from other mediums and really distinguishes contemporary games from their more primitive forerunners. The medium has finally come into its own and embraced the idea that mechanics and gameplay shouldn't be separable. The story of the game is the story of your specific playing of it, with the mechanics of gameplay serving to reinforce the plot and themes of the game. Gone are the simplistic days when even mainstream games with good stories had to tell them through cinematics and dialogue in between the exciting action bits. This is, of course, something we've always talked about with older games, something which has spawned hundreds of webcomics and funny forum posts and long-winded discussions. The extent to which earlier, more primitive games were limited by their medium and how they could tell their stories. The epitome of this problem in classic games is 1990s Japanese RPGs, where the story and gameplay were kept totally distinct, where plot happened in cutscenes and dialogue, and then gameplay happened in turn-based combat, with a bunch of numbers and stats that never reflected the story. Or, as one of the internet's pioneers and loud opinions put it,
"What I'm saying is that I like games where the story and gameplay go hand in hand, while in most JRPGs the story and gameplay are kept either side of a wrought iron fence made of tigers."
These games were the best we could do for storytelling then, but they were off-putting and unrealistic, with gameplay that operated at a distant remove from storytelling and characters who were just numbers on a sheet outside of cutscenes. Of course, that's not the case. Games have been using mechanics and story to reinforce each other longer than I've been alive, and I wouldn't have cited the very specific genre of 1990s turn-based JRPGs if I didn't have a specific counterexample in mind. Phantasy Star 4, The End of the Millennium, came out in 1995, 1993 in Japan, and as a Sega Genesis RPG released in America only 3 months before the next Sega console came out and a year after Final Fantasy VI revolutionized the genre, doesn't quite hold the place in history that some of its contemporaries did. It's shorter and simpler than a lot of other RPGs of that era without the ability to swap out party members, and a mostly linear world. It's still great. The combat system is fast-paced and streamlined, the story's got a cool blend of science fiction, fantasy, and post-apocalypse, and it has a breezy pace almost entirely free of repetitive grinding and obtuse side quests. It was, more importantly, an eye-opener when I first played it. I hadn't played any RPGs before, and I didn't even know the genre existed, that there were games that told long, complex stories with worlds to explore and interactions between characters. And a big part of how it tells those characters' story, especially through the first act of the game that establishes the characters and their dynamics, was through the game's mechanics, through the way that they fight together in battle, or the pace at which they level up, or the way their skills develop. And I want to make something very clear here. Phantasy Star 4 is in no way the only game that does this. This kind of thing is all over classic gaming, it just requires a little more unpacking than we usually see today. I'm choosing this game because it's one I know inside out, and because its relative linearity and more simple mechanics make this really apparent once you notice it. But the idea that games didn't bother with integrating their mechanics or their storytelling before 1998 or so, or that certain genres and eras were uniquely unsuited to this, is one that even a relatively cult game like Final Fantasy IV exposes as a lie. Also, a final bit of waffling. Due to character limitations, all characters in the first 4 Phantasy Star games have 4-letter names in the English versions, and thus tend to have pretty different names from the original Japanese. I'll be using the English ones here because it's the version 99% of my audience will play and because I'm not a complete embarrassment. Also, apologies in advance for how I'm probably going to pronounce Japanese names. Phantasy Star 4 is the fourth, I have to clarify because of the Game Gear spin-offs and the Sega MegaNet text adventure, and last game in the main Phantasy Star series, developed by many of the same team who worked with Yuji Naka on the Sonic the Hedgehog games, and directed by Rieko Kodama, who did the character design for the first Phantasy Star, alongside fellow Sega veteran Toru Yoshida. Kodama is, incidentally, a fascinating character in her own right, hugely responsible for a lot of the art in Sega's early games, and one of the most important women in game design of that era. The series was always a little oddball. The first game came out almost simultaneously with the first Final Fantasy, but had less of a sense of tactical combat, some adventure game elements, and a radically different setting. Kodama was a big Star Wars buff, and as a Japanese designer, wanted to do her own take on the ways Star Wars riffed on samurai movies and East Asian aesthetics, by filling the space opera-style sci-fi adventure she was working on with Western fantasy visuals and fairy tale monsters. She also designed one of gaming's first female protagonists, only a year after Samus debuted and started a long tradition of showing her underwear as a reward for beating Metroid games, and designed one of the characters to be androgynous after having the idea during character design that they had a fluid or a non-binary gender, at least to the extent that a mid-80s Japanese graphic designer would understand that concept. So, that's pretty neat. Phantasy Star 4 tells the story of Alice, a professional monster hunter, and Chaz, her teenage protege. As monster hunters, they're also just about the only JRPG heroes who have an in-universe reason to be getting paid for random encounters, too. They live on Motavia, a planet which was once a desert before being colonized and terraformed by a humanoid people, and following the destruction of their homeworld, the collapse of the terraforming systems, and the reversion of their society to a new Dark Age, is rapidly turning back into a desert. From the start of the game, you understand the relationship between these two characters, not just through how they talk, but through how they play. Alice is older, tougher, and stronger than Chaz. She has more skills, and she can hit multiple enemies. In fact, because enemies are more aggressive towards whomever you designate as the party leader, and she has much better defense, she'll be the one leading the party, interacting with the environment, and serving as the voice of your team. She's also the one who makes the actual decisions, including the choice to recruit Han, a concerned grad student who is almost as capable in combat as Chaz. Chaz isn't a slouch by any means, but he's clearly a backup character, one whose purpose is to pick off individual enemies, finish off foes whittled down by Alice's boomerangs, and to help with healing. It's fairly clear who's in charge here. The story is one of a woman of question mark age, probably her late 30s, the teenage boy she's training, and the biologist who is technically your customer, but who is very clearly not the one calling the shots. And then, after you finish the first dungeon and fight a fairly easy boss and learn about the Dark Wizard who threatens the world, two major things happen that change the power dynamics of the game. The first one is a fairly simple RPG standard. You go to the first weapon shop and upgrade your starting gear, and Chaz buys a sword. Up until now, he's only been using knives, just like Han, and using healing techniques, just like Han. Buying a sword ups his damage output considerably and makes it more clear what his role in combat is. He can now hit individual enemies harder than anyone else. I like this little bit of characterization. He finished his first big assignment away from home, spent his first paycheck, and gets to start really finding his own footing in his job. And I like that it's saved until after you finish the game's starting area, when you have to spend some time dealing with having a major character who can't do anything that other people can't do about as well. The second event is much more major. You meet one of the game's other main characters, Rune. He's a couple RPG standards at once, being both a spellcaster with low physical attack, and a party member who only tags along for a very brief period but is extremely powerful. But there's a couple neat ways they play with this. The first is that Rune has what are called skills, combat abilities that, rather than drawing from a shared pool of mana, or TP in this game, have their own limited uses and thus are great for situational use, since you don't have to worry about them costing resources you could use for other things. Now, Rune also claims to use actual magic, while everyone else gets their special abilities from tools and technology, so the fact that he joins your party with a bunch of powerful skills that work differently from everyone else's, and whose low cost encourages you to play around with them, drive home precisely what Rune is all about. He's mysterious, he can do things no one else can, and he's absolutely using his mystical ancient powers to show off and impress Alice, who is very clearly his ex. You learn so much more about who Rune is and how strange he is in this world from the way he controls in battle than you ever do from his cryptic conversations and his aloof demeanor. And this ties into the other neat mechanical thing about Rune as a party member. Like I said, he's got a low physical attack for his level, but he's level 17 and Chaz is, most likely, level 4. And so Rune can hit about as hard as Chaz with his regular weapon while taking much more damage. So here Chaz is, having just found something he's good at, and in comes a new guy with awesome magical abilities and a cool mysterious mission, past with Alice that Chaz knows nothing about, and he's as good as Chaz is at the one thing Chaz found he can do for himself. And this is all mechanics. It's all expressed through the combat. You spend 5 minutes getting to enjoy Chaz shining as a single target damage dealer before you immediately move on to the cool new character, and Chaz has to take back seat again. Chaz, being a teenager, mostly sulks about it, but the game uses its RPG mechanics, stats, and combat abilities to very clearly delineate the way these characters feel about themselves and about each other. People often complain that the gameplay in JRPGs just consists of watching numbers get bigger, and here's Phantasy Star 4 telling a little story about a teenager having to deal with his cool older mentor having a relationship with someone who makes him look like a little kid, and using those big numbers to do most of the heavy narrative lifting. Alright, buckle in for a second, folks, because I'm gonna get artsy. James Joyce has a story called Araby that, alongside Eveline and the Dead, is one of his masterpieces of short fiction. It's the first-person story of a young boy on the cusp of puberty who is infatuated with an older girl, attempts to buy something for her as a show of adulthood and independence, and realizes at the end, fidgeting with his useless pocket change, that he's still a child, that there's no way a teenage girl won't see him as just a child. I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. I don't want to say that Phantasy Star 4 is Joycean in its mastery of its characters or its understanding of technique, not because it's inherently inferior, but because different mediums have different emphases and strengths, and when I want Joyce, I read Joyce, not play Sega. But still, these are the emotions it's dealing with in these interactions. Adolescent striving, the need to be recognized by the adults you want to be a peer of, the resentment when you're reminded you're still a kid. It's real stuff, relatable human character dynamics and conflict, expressed by attack power and combat skills and party composition. Rune is a cocky jerk, but it's fairly clear why he gets under Chaz's skin more than anyone else's, even though Chaz never acknowledges this resentment in dialogue. People point to the way contemporary indie RPGs use combat prompts and mechanical elements to tell stories, but it's not just indies, and it's not just now. These things have been going on in games for decades if you're willing to pick apart the mechanics and look at what they're doing. Again, Phantasy Star 4 is not a literary masterpiece or telling an ambiguous, nuanced story. It's an exciting space adventure with laser swords and a cat girl. But we can't ignore that those techniques are there, and we understand the medium better if we keep an understanding of their usage. And this is about as clear-cut as it gets without giving Chaz a status effect called inferiority complex. There's a moment at the end of Lisa the Painful, a really great indie RPG that's a master of this kind of mechanical storytelling, where the protagonist's class changes from nobody to failure. Phantasy Star 4 isn't so direct about it, and it's definitely a smaller bit of narrative. But this episode, when Chaz gets 5 minutes to shine as the star party member and is then immediately pushed to the back row, is just as much a piece of mechanical storytelling and just as well executed within the mechanics of the game. Fortunately, Phantasy Star 4 is not the tragic tale of a broken man ruining his every chance at human connection. It's, as stated, a fun space adventure. So there's more to the arc than just this disappointment. Rune leaves the party shortly, and immediately afterwards you get a long and brutal dungeon crawl that makes you really, really miss him. Then there's a little bit of combat storytelling that I love. You fight another copy of the same boss you took on in the very first dungeon. Now, after that first fight, where Chaz was using knives, Alice complained that his swing was too slow. But this time, not only does Chaz have a sword, but due to the way the game's level scaling is timed, he'll almost certainly have just learned a skill that lets him attack twice in one turn, which he can only use if he has a sword equipped. This isn't story-driven, it's just a new combat skill that emerges at the perfect moment due to really good pacing and very careful planning on the part of the developers. The first time you fought the boss, Chaz was picking off the other enemies that spawned. Now, Alice is on crowd control while Chaz takes point. He gets to show off again. He carries the fight. Lots of video games do a setup like this. Here's a boss that gave you trouble before, have fun taking it apart now that you're stronger. But I love how this is tied together with that first encounter. Chaz learned a new skill that was a direct response to his weaknesses in the first fight, and gets to come into his own as a fighter, and you suddenly have abilities that directly counter a boss you just had to use brute force on before. I especially like that Chaz's crosscut skill isn't gained through a training montage or a story event. It's a perfect bit of design that it comes out of his natural level growth, and again shows his growth as a character and a fighter through more subtle mechanical means. There wasn't a mission or a side quest or even overt acknowledgement of it. He just received criticism and silently filed it away as something to work on. The fact that he masters this skill just a little while after Rune leaves the party feels like a very surly teenager moment of character growth, too. Then things start to get rough. You set off to take out the aforementioned Dark Wizard, not really as a job, just because you're sick and tired of all the trouble he's causing. While you're fighting your way through his castle, you'll notice two things. Chaz is really coming into his own as a party member, and Han really isn't. Han still has access to some good techniques and reliable support abilities, but he just can't handle the beating that these newer, tougher enemies are putting out. It becomes clear he's not going to survive if things get much more serious. Chaz really reaches parity with Alice around this point. He's about the same level, the two of them work together great, with her focus on group damage helping eliminate weak enemies, while he goes after the toughest foes. And unless you're rushing through the game, this is around the point that Alice picks up a new skill which can instantly kill a single non-boss enemy, something that's clearly going to be a godsend getting you out of the occasional random encounter. There's never a moment when it's discussed, but Chaz isn't an apprentice anymore. He and Alice are a team who have come to depend on each other and form the offensive backbone of the party. And then that backbone gets broken, and Alice dies. When the tragedy comes, it's not instantaneous. You finally get a shot at the villain you've been chasing, but you can't scratch him. He targets Chaz with a new attack, unlike anything you've seen before, and Alice throws herself in front of it. You have to run. She's sick and hurt, and nothing's healing her, not even things which should be able to revive a downed character. She's wasting away, and you've got a lead on something that might counteract the dark magic she was hit by. On the way there, you run into Rune again, but things are different now. There's nothing to fight over with Alice sick, and he and Chaz are finally on the same page. He doesn't seem so cool anymore either. Chaz has caught up to him in a lot of ways and isn't just a tag-along kid anymore. The tower you fight through alongside him is so long and grueling that you can't just burn through his skill uses for fun. And Rune suddenly needs someone who can reliably deal weapon damage without using up limited resources. Things are serious, and the cocky, arrogant wizard suddenly needs a helping hand, but he also doesn't seem like quite such an annoyance now that you're down to the wire. The game introduces some enemies which are near immune to normal melee damage, but which Rune can devastate easily. For the first time, his magic is actually necessary instead of being a fun toy. And in a great little touch, Flaeli, the exact spell Rune shows off when he's first talking up magic, is almost useless against the first boss you face with him. You get a real sense of grudging respect, whereas before Rune was just an unnecessarily strong showboat who made Chaz irrelevant. They suddenly need each other. The dungeon will be nearly impossible without Chaz's newfound ability to consistently pour on melee damage, or Rune's skill at more limited use powerhouse magic. And of course it's happening when they're both trying to save a woman who's very important to both of them. Earlier we saw how the two of them had a pretty huge disparity, centered around their relationships with Alice. Now it's that same relationship which brings them together and makes them into a team. Again, I want to stress, this is all in combat. This is never discussed. Rune never says, "Couldn't do it without you, Chaz." Chaz never says, "Well, I guess you're not such a jerk after all." It's all in gameplay. It's an invisible arc, but it's absolutely there. Just as Chaz and Alice felt like a team the day before, he and Rune are operating as equals now. It's a real meat grinder of a dungeon, and you'll find yourself over and over again, grateful for everyone's skills, feeling like nothing is wasted. It's a great way to get you committed to your characters, and because Chaz is suddenly forced to carry the game without Alice around to help, to make you feel his growing commitment to the team. The story's shifted from him and his mentor doing work for hire to him having a personal investment in real world-threatening stakes, at the exact moment that all your core party members are falling into place and everyone's picking up the skills that are going to define the way they play as a team. Because he has to step up. I wasn't being coy earlier. These two characters go through a crucible trying to save someone, and it's not enough. Alice dies. It's really, really well done. The game spends more of its visual resources on this than on most other major story moments. The music for the scene is one of the best tracks in a game already full of all-time great songs. And I really respect the fact that, when going for its big, tragic moment, the game doesn't get violent or shocking or have a huge twist. It's a sick woman dying in a near stranger's bed, and her friends and her ex spending the night talking about what she meant to them. Also, Han? He's out. A person just died in his fiance's house. He wants to teach biology and have kids, and he can't stomach this anymore. On a purely functional level, you as a player know why. You don't have enough space in your party anymore. But it feels right in a way it wouldn't if, again, the game didn't pay such careful attention to the way that your characters gain skills and the way their stats work. While Han used to be able to carry his weight, it's become a struggle getting him through tougher fights intact, and he's probably been spending more time unconscious than any other character, and now the toughest person he ever met is dead. It doesn't make sense for him to stick around. I really love this. Han's had a low defense and HP since he joined the party, and it's pretty clear that, again, these stats are having a narrative impact. The guy is keenly aware that he's a frail support character who's getting outpaced by the rest of the team, and if people are going to be dying, he's right to believe he'd be next. It's a moment of pretty perfect Ludonarrative, where it's taken as given by the characters in-universe that the random encounters have been real and are a valid measurement of their abilities. It's also a perfect transition from a narrative perspective. Of the three people who went into that first dungeon, one is gone forever, and one is done with this mission. It's just Chaz left. You've got new friends, two of whom will be by your side for the rest of the game, but just as he was coming into his own, he suddenly has to carry all that weight. And you feel it in the gameplay. That new instant kill ability Alice just got? She's the only character in the game who can learn it, and none of the other instant kill skills work quite like it, and you likely only got to use it once or twice. Her combat skills, which focused on using physical attacks, damage buffs, absorbing damage, and hitting multiple enemies, there's never a character who fills all those niches again. You can go back to your hometown and talk to your neighbors now them ask where Alice is, but you feel the ache just as keenly when the game spends the next quarter of its runtime throwing crowds of weak enemies at you that Alice could have really chewed up. The game's macro system, which lets you pre-program certain chains of attacks, makes this especially painful. You're going to have to go in and delete every single one, since they were all built around a character who's never coming back. So there it is, the first third to half of the game, where the characters meet and go through their initial arcs and suffer loss and learn their purpose. And it's all expressed mechanically. There's a lot of story and plot developments, but every single one is backed up by these mechanical changes, and all of the important character relationships are clearly expressed through gameplay. There's more to the game, of course. Half the characters haven't even shown up yet. You've only beaten one of the 6 major story bosses. But this is the core of it. These characters and their relationships and the way they learn to fight together. You'll see more detours and story moments like this, where stats and combat abilities are used to flesh out the world and the characters. I particularly like that when the game brings back a villain and dungeon from the infamously hard Phantasy Star 1, there's a huge difficulty spike, or the fact that the best attack against the final boss is a hidden combo that requires skills only Chaz and Rune can learn and use together, or that the game's android characters have special abilities which make it very clear they were built for millennia of isolation. But it's in these interactions at the beginning that I think the game's grasp of mechanical storytelling shines the brightest. Wait, there's one more moment. At the very end of the game, in a secret dungeon tucked away on a secret planet, you can get a new ability for Chaz. It's hugely damaging and is the strongest purely offensive multi-target technique he can learn. When you step into the room where it's waiting for you, Chaz finds himself alone. This happened at the beginning of the game. You control Chaz in isolation for a few minutes before you find Alice. And there she is, waiting for you. And she tries to kill you. You're alone without your party. Alice is using the same attacks she always did, ones which are uniquely unsuited to fighting a single person, while Chaz's skill set makes him a perfect match for her. It's not a huge boss fight, it's not even as hard as the generic enemies you had to get through to reach here. The woman whose presence has loomed over your whole adult life turns out to be purely ordinary, someone you've surpassed. It's an illusion, of course. The game plays the haunting music from her death over the fight, only to horrifyingly cut the same jaunty victory music as always when she's defeated. You kill her and she's gone, and the whole thing was a test. If you give in to the anger you're feeling, you'll be destroyed. You can't let yourself be too hurt by what happened. You can't let the wound be too raw. If you go through that fight and are willing to forgive, aren't too hurt by what you see, you're granted the most powerful technique. In the earlier games, Megid, or Megiddo, was just a powerful move that the protagonist could learn at a high level. Here, it's a marker, a tacit acknowledgement that the game is coming to a close. You go through a mirror of the beginning, when Chaz wasn't special and had no real skills to his name, and then you're given a gift for the ending, something strange and frightening only he can control. When you use Megid, which you will because Chaz has plenty of skills but no other real offensive techniques in its tier, it's not just the best spell, but a reminder of how far you've come, a constant token of what you've been through. And it's a reminder that, as much as Alice meant, she's gone, and it's time to move on. I'm not saying that Phantasy Star 4 invented this kind of storytelling, that every RPG to play these kinds of narrative games is secretly a knockoff of a cult Sega Genesis title. But it's interesting, right? We look at all these postmodern and clever and self-aware games and we talk about how we're living in an advancing age of ludonarrative cohesion and gameplay plot integration. But these tools have always been there. Looking back, we can see games playing with these ideas, maybe not going for them as full bore, but present in games from an era that we tend to think of as being dominated solely by commercial concerns and ignorant of the artistic potential of the medium. JRPGs are often maligned for their ludonarrative dissidence, for having a clear-cut divide between plot and gameplay, and I'm very sorry, but that simply isn't true. The fact that people aren't talking during combat doesn't mean that story isn't happening, and Phantasy Star shows us that. It trusts us to pay attention during the fights and not to see them as abstractions, to consider how the skills our characters have really impact their place in the world and their relationships with each other. Retro gaming is alive and well in the medium, but I do worry that the reason people play retro games is, increasingly, boiled down to either fun or nostalgia, that gamers as a whole are becoming like a generation of film critics who don't care about silent or black and white movies. And you can see this in the way that older games are discussed. JRPGs especially get treated as a relic, with new ones either aimed at people who are way into the aesthetics and retro elements, or focusing entirely on subverting and playing with the genre. Phantasy Star is a great example of what the genre not only can do, but was always doing, and of the fact that the divide between narrative and gameplay was, in the earlier days of the medium, never quite so clear as the way we say it is now, nor were the genres so rigid and codified. The very first Phantasy Star game, in the mid-80s, looked at the male-driven fantasy story of Dragon Quest and decided to tell a female-driven sci-fi story. The second Phantasy Star, despite its crude technical limitations, is relentlessly paranoid and unflinchingly tragic in a way that most indie RPGs even now shy away from, ending with an apocalyptic collapse and your protagonist deciding to fight a doomed battle after failing to save billions of lives. The third game is, well, it has a couple interesting ideas, but it tries so hard to be big and ambitious that it doesn't do anything very well. And again, these games aren't famous. They're a neat series that set some impressive landmarks in the genre, but they're one of a dozen JRPG franchises that all push the envelope like this. It's not just Earthbound. The medium has been subverting its own genre conventions and playing with tropes for as long as they've existed. There's a hubris, I think, in acting like now that we've all grown up and are all mature, we're the first people to notice things like the combat cutscene divide in old RPGs. Not only were these things always known, but there have always been people like Kodama, Yoshida, and their team working around them. We played these games as children, or we thought of them as retro games and period pieces. But the next time you play a classic game, whether you're revisiting Mega Man 2 or your preferred Final Fantasy, or if I've convinced you to check out the Phantasy Star series, turn your critical brain on. Read too much into it. Look at what the mechanics are making you feel and how things click together and how the systems work, and really try to unpack what you're seeing. The way that Kodama and her Sonic team compatriots used numbers and battle techniques to tell the story of a relationship between a teenager and a wizard is something I didn't notice until I started thinking about it, but now I find myself seeing it in other JRPGs, catching other moments and mechanics that tell similar stories. When you unlock a piece of art like this, it changes the way you experience an entire medium, and games have decades worth of art you probably haven't tried to pick apart. So go pick up something old or forgotten or nostalgic, and really try to see how it works, see where it takes you. I bet you'll be surprised how much more is going on than you thought, and how much more it tells a story through your experience than games of those days are supposed to. Alright, that's the ball game, folks. Thanks for sticking around this long. I apologize for any audio or visual problems. I'm still fairly new at this and getting the hang of the hardware and software. I don't have an excuse for any writing problems. I tend to go long when I write and I tend to ramble, but you'll just have to put up with that. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. I'm very new to this, so anything you can do to help out with the algorithms, I appreciate. More than anything, if you liked it, try showing it to other people who might like it. Again, this is the first thing I'm putting out, so I would really appreciate anyone sharing the word around that I have interesting things to say, or that at least I have a soothing, monotone nerd drone. If you want to, you can follow me on Twitter at Yaz_Minsky. I get a little political sometimes, so if you got turned off by my extremely mild praise for social justice issues, you probably don't want to stick around. Again, please try and subscribe. I've got some other projects I'm working on. Next up, we should have an analysis of how Wolfenstein handles fascism in a more responsible way than most video games. And then the biggest project I've got in the pipe right now is going to be an examination of how Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri is a critique both of the Civilization franchise and of mid-90s liberalism. So again, thank you for sticking around. I really appreciate it if you've watched this, and I hope to have more content for you soon. And again, sorry for anything that was bad. I can't promise it's going to get better, but I'll try and be nice to listen to. Bye.